Thank you, all of you. My name is Professor Jim Soto. I teach philosophy and English here at SC4. And sometimes the way I introduce myself is with the following joke. Yes, I know Tom O.B. I am his replacement. Again, thank you all for coming today. And I have a lot of thank yous to get through because this would not happen if it weren't for the Michigan Council of Arts and Cultural Affairs. They gave us the money. And given to us also by Dr. Jennifer Callens with the Anton Art Center. Is Jennifer Callens here? I know she was here. She said she might be here. Well, thank you to Dr. Callens for giving us this grant to bring Tom Hayden here. I also want to thank tonight's speaker. Tom has been wonderfully generous with his time with us. We took him to classes. In fact, I walked into my introduction to philosophy class this morning. Did not give him a syllabus. Did not take roll. I basically said, blah, 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 here's Tom. And Tom just picked up and ran with it. And we ran Tom all over today, and he's been wonderful. And I can't believe I got to spend last night and today with him. Now, my introductory remarks, I'm going to keep them short, but I'm not going to go too much into the history of the Port Huron Statement. Many of you know, written in 1962 at Lakeport State Park. It used to be United Auto Workers Camp. And that's as far as I'm going to go. If you want more information on the sort of history of the document, there's many, many works out there. What I want to do is sort of place it just a little bit in the sort of history of political philosophy. If you look at political philosophy dating back to Plato, often political philosophy begins with some sort of idealization, the sort of idealized version that they want to strive after. Plato famously argued for the form of the city, the perfect state, and that perfect state was one that was well ordered, all people were doing their prescribed role. And then the mechanism to bring about that particular state was the philosopher king. The philosophers should be kings in order to rule because the philosopher kings had knowledge and they would run the state and they would rule based upon knowledge. Now, if we fast forward quite a bit, we get to Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes famously argued that for a particular idealization, and that was the state of nature is a state of war. That if you left all of us to our own devices, we would just simply kill each other. We would be fighting and fighting and fighting, and just be blood in the streets. The way to avoid that idealization, Hobbes thought, is that we should put all of our power to kill each other in the hands of an all-powerful sovereign, the Leviathan. The Leviathan was the one with power to scare you to not kill the person next to you. Please don't do that. Again, I want to fast forward just a little bit more past Hobbes, and I want to talk about Karl Marx. Oh yes, somebody had to say it. So Marx very famously argued for an idealization, and his idealization was the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle. He thought that if you looked at any particular time period, you would see class struggle. You would see rich versus poor. You would see serfs versus the people inside of the castle. You would always see that class struggle. And that class struggle was the engine that drove history. What drove history, what drove change and feedback was this idea of class struggle. Marx thought that the mechanism to bring about the socialist utopia where we all got paid the same and we were all proletarians was just to leave your hands off of it. eventually that class struggle will play out, and we'll have the socialist revolution, and et cetera, and so on. What I see as a philosopher, and what I teach in my classes, and my students are going to hear way too much of this later in the semester. What the Students for a Democratic Society did, and what the Port Huron Statement does, is instead of focusing on that idealization, and then coming up with some sort of mechanism to bring about that idealization or to avoid the idealization, they tended to put the idealization, or sorry, the mechanism, totally screwed that up. They tended to emphasize the mechanism of social change. And the mechanism of social change that they put forward, and that all of you are living right now, is participatory democracy. That through participatory democracy, we can change the society in which we live. And with that, it is just my honor to introduce Mr. Tom Hayden.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Port Huron. The imaginary Port Huron, at least. I have to tell you that I'm really happy to be here. I'm blessed to be alive and around and to carry memories and to have an opportunity, not for a reunion, but certainly for something more important than nostalgia. I've only been here a couple of times over the years, once in 1962 and again in about 1988. And you know, as they say in the old spiritual, this may be the last time. So I'd like to make the most of it. And speaking of that, I need to thank Jim Soto, who's had an amazing day. I think he's going to have a nervous breakdown in about 1 hour. But let's I think I've spoken on this subject now 8 times today since this morning, and I came here from a brief stay at home, and before that Austin, Texas, and it's difficult when you're not campaigning. It's even harder, I guess, when you are campaigning, to keep repeating the same speeches. You can't remember if you just said this to the person you're talking to. I don't know if it's evolution, or I don't know how candidates even get created who can give that many speeches a day with people yelling at them to stay on message. So if I forget anything or leave anything out, it's for that reason, jet lag. And the pace I've been on, but it's been great. And I want to thank the community college and Dr. Pollock, the president. Thank you very much for hosting me, and the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs, the Anton Art Center. Without your help, I wouldn't be here. And the students that I met today. And I think I'm speaking spontaneously without notes, but I'm trying to guess from the subject of today's conversations that there's a series of things that I should address. It may take a little time. I hope to be efficient. First, what we did here in Port Huron in June of 1962. Second, what we said. Third, what happened, what came of it. Fourth, what went wrong, if anything. What would you do over? And where are we now? How does it matter today? in one sense, it shouldn't matter, because we always want to memorialize our history. That's why we have gravestones and monuments and memorials, and we write. And keepers of history, storytellers are important for what they do in its own right, period. But it's of some significance that this document, the Port Huron Statement, reverberates today. For instance, in the Occupy Wall Street movement of last September, the first principle, one of the few things that they could agree on, was that participatory democracy was their transcendent principle, and that was a concept that was first announced in the Port Huron Statement, and it was transmitted by a philosophy professor that we knew in Ann Arbor, and before him, the American philosopher John Dewey, and before him, Henry David Thoreau in his pamphlet on civil disobedience. Turn off your cell phones, please. I will. So it is current, and I think there's a reason for that. While I have your attention, I'll give the conclusion, and then work up to it. The reason for that is something that I've studied and I've experienced. We live in what I would call a constitutional democracy with a representative government. You're all familiar with the format. You elect your politicians. They zone the community. They run the schools. They create taxes, business incentives, loopholes, send people to war. All kinds of things are done by the people we represent. And it took a long struggle against Parliament and against monarchy to achieve that goal. But it's certainly worth re-examining whether representation is enough. When you think about what a politician has to go through, raising money on the one hand, and getting elected by 51% over and over, meaning 40 or 49% of the people are against them, meaning there are continual organized interest groups at the local level. It's hard to feel that you personally are being represented with the full attention of your elected officials. You're very lucky if you get a minute of their time. It's a very difficult process, and a lot of people, myself included, think that it's broken or breaking down and in need of repair. So that's what most students are taught about representative democracy and its various spectacles. Participatory democracy, I think, is not the opposite, but it's a stimulus to, or it's a supplement to, and it could take the place of representation, but I don't think so. Participatory democracy does not come from a theory. It comes from an experience of two things. One, an effective group of people like yourselves is really pained and feels morally insulted by some policy, and you have a concrete grievance. It could be, we want to vote. It could be that simple. So your moral injury can be translated into something specific as a remedy. And the second thing is that the representative institutions, or all the institutions, the banks you count on, the religious institutions, the universities, all the institutions have failed, in your judgment, from your feelings, to deliver on what you need to live a decent life, and you can't take it anymore. It comes a breaking point where you won't settle and you have to do something. At that point, no theory is necessary. We've seen it over and over, that people then rise up in small gatherings in their neighborhoods and assemblies. They begin to discuss, they come to a conclusion, this is what we want. They map out the decision-making territory that they have to navigate. They try to figure out pressure points. They usually go outside of the institutions that have failed them. They start with demonstrations, or they petition, or they have press conferences to try to shame some public official. That's all that is meant, really, by participatory democracy. It can be small scale, it can be the American Revolution, which would not have happened without participatory democracy. So it doesn't boil down to, is it a small pragmatic step forward or is it a big sweeping change? The test is how many people, with what intensity, have come together outside the institutions, joined together to participate in a movement for their cause. And usually when it succeeds, and it tends to succeed over a long period of time, women's right to vote, 100 years, 100 continual years. When it succeeds, many of its parents, its fathers and mothers, its progenitors, have become so frustrated that they don't even think it's going to matter that much anymore. They've divided into so many factions and had so many arguments they tire. But they succeed, and when they succeed, they take what they won and they use it in everyday life because we want to live normal lives. And it's abnormal to go to all these meetings. This is abnormal for Port Huron, I'm sure, to have Tom Hayden speak to so many people, and I'm sorry about you in the lobby. Right, but you follow. And then when they succeed, they return to everyday life. The people who've been radicalized, they feel kind of stranded. Where did the masses go? Where did everybody go? Well, they went home is usually the answer. Went back to work. The people who feel they lost the big argument actually become more galvanized because now they think they're losing everything that they believed in. So you get this movement, succeeds, and it goes into a counter movement that fights back. We're very much in this process today in our national election, but I think we act it out in our everyday lives. So that's the idea of participatory democracy. And in our case, we were students and we were caught up in the beginning of 1960 because of several things that happened. One, people like ourselves in the South, black students, took direct action to desegregate lunch counters and bus terminals and so on. And I moved from Michigan to Georgia and to Mississippi to join them. I was in the first Freedom Rides, but I was really there as a narrator and as a writer for the Michigan Daily trying to describe this. I found it shocking and stimulating. I fell in love with these young people because they had decided that there was something that they believed in enough, they had purpose enough that they were willing to risk their reputations. In the old saying of the founders, their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. And I found really nothing. I was reading Mad Magazine. I read On the Road. I hitchhiked to the West Coast to see what Berkeley was like. I was a student journalist who wanted more. And all it took was this suggestion, this moral suggestion by the Southern students, and oh my God, all across the country, students in the North were forming sympathetic organizations. So that was the first thing, learning that you could take matters into your own hands, there could be direct action, and it could wake up other people of your generation or your parents' generation as well. Secondly, there was the fear of the nuclear war. That we had a Cuban Missile Crisis, a few of us remember, but it's really traumatizing to be raised in Royal Oak, Michigan, and be told by the nuns that when there's an atomic bomb that goes off, you should be under your desk. And there was this whole, like, developers were trying to cash in on selling the idea to homeowners that you should build shelters in your backyard. If you couldn't afford a shelter, you were like expendable. And so it took us a long time. I think this is why we read Mad Magazine, because it was mad, because our authority figures were telling us something that made no sense in our experience, because we had seen the Hiroshima and Nagasaki blasts, how could being under a desk without sunglasses keep you whole? So you will remember, and it's never to be forgotten, that we lived in fear and trembling that there would be an atomic war. I was 6 when those bombs went off in Japan. And you don't forget things from your childhood, they kind of magnify. So that also was a great fear. And the reason these things came together is that we started to feel that if all the attention of our country and other countries on the planet was setting up deterrence system based on atomic bombs and nuclear bombs, there would be no energy, no time, and no funding to do something about jobs and urban development, economic development, invest in agriculture, better schools, because money was not just limitless. So it was kind of an either or. And in a funny way, we had been pushed forward also by 2 presidents at the beginning of this. One was Eisenhower, who after he left office had the vision for some reason to speak of the military-industrial complex. He put the words out there. He warned on the basis of having been a general and a president that there was a dangerous alignment between the military and the contractors that were making the weapons, and that they could be a threat to our democratic system. This was coming from Eisenhower as a farewell message. He hadn't done, as far as I know, he hadn't done anything about it, but God bless him for having said this. And I can't tell you how important that was for everybody in my generation when we heard this. Then he was followed by a younger man, John Kennedy, who actually I think became president when he was younger than Barack Obama. And Kennedy, being young, with a younger brother, Bobby, was close enough to us in age that I think he probably created an inspirational atmosphere that encouraged people of my generation to do something. Specifically, I remember I was in a group as a student editor. I was in this group at the campus that somebody had the zaniness to call Americans Committed to World Responsibility, ACWR. And this was a group of students, highly energized. I gave my first speech to them. It's not going to be like tonight. I typed it out. It was 19 single-spaced pages, and I read it. So I've cut it, and it's missing to it. It's gone. No record of it. But the idea was that some U.S. senators had called for students to do alternative service to military service as a version of being drafted for a call to the nation's purpose that was compatible with, but separate from the military. And we thought this was a good idea. I have to remind you that this was a time when I took my physical in New York at Whitehall. You could be inducted into the military, but not vote for or against the politicians that set the policies. So we thought this was very inspiring to us, that we might be able to have choices in how we serve the country. And we typed up a letter in Ann Arbor, and there were 11 of us that signed it, and we gave it to John Kennedy when he was coming down the hallway. This was a time when you could do this. That would be impossible now. But he's coming down the hallway. He opened the letter, he read it, he said, put it in his pocket, said, I'll say something about that later. He changed his speech that night on October, on a rainy night in October, and he gave a speech calling for the Peace Corps. And he did it against the advice of his staff. I know that because the next day, after he had done this, he'd gone off to California or somewhere, and they called back to Ann Arbor to our group, said, what the hell did you get us into? What is this? Because they didn't have a proposal. And they knew that Nixon and the media would be saying, well, what are you talking about? What is this crazy idea? And there was no white paper, there was no document, only us. And the sense that a president or presidential candidate could look right at you and respond to your aspiration and say, let's work together towards this goal, I think that, along with Eisenhower's statement, it made it seem, and how it feels is really everything, but it made it seem that a lot was possible. Maybe all things were possible. And there's nothing more intoxicating to a young person than believing that they can make a huge difference by making a commitment, and that the difference might actually matter enough to come true. So that was the context. So we came to Port Huron because we wanted to form a student organization that would empower students on the campuses through student government, through newspapers, student newspapers. And most of the students, some came from the South, University of Texas, some came from Mississippi, Alabama, from the Civil Rights Movement. A lot came from the Midwest and the Northeast. Not many came from California, from the West. Only about 50 or 60 people. And they said, we have to have a vision statement. I think you would call that today. You call it, what do you call it? A mission statement. I don't know what we called it. But it was to be a document that we could hand out on campus to recruit. We didn't have email. This is maybe astonishing to many of you. We actually had typewriters and cassetteners and envelopes and stamps. That was, yeah, and yellow pads. And so I was told to write it in draft form, and then we would discuss it at this conference in Port Huron, and from there we would issue our vision to the world and try to recruit students and build chapters. It was that simple. Well, it was not that simple, because you're talking about some very philosophical people, myself included. So I just buried myself in a library and went around interviewing people and read 40 or 50 books and put together this thing which was monstrous. It was 25,000 words in draft. I don't know if you know how long that is. I think other famous manifestos and declarations of independence run in the several hundred pages, some shorter. We're talking here about a virtual constitution. And so it's all sent out, and everybody arrives, and we came to Port Huron, and over a 5-day period, broke it down into parts. Our vision of the world, our moral values, the state of universities, the condition of students in our society, foreign policy, the Cold War, the Third World Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, and kind of where we go from here. The idea was building independent student movement which would act like a catalyst or a trigger to awaken our elders in labor, in religious institutions, in universities, and across the land, and they would influence the two-party system, particularly with the objective of breaking the grip of the white Southern segregationist Democrats over the Democratic Party. At the time, 17 of 21 committees in the U.S. Senate were held by long-standing segregationist senators whose constituencies were largely black, who were not able to vote. So we realized voting was not just a moral issue of equality, it was also a strategic issue, because if black people in the South were empowered to vote, it would topple the long-standing segregationist control of the South that had been there since the failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War. It was a grandiose project. So we had this meeting that went on for 5 days, and what did Port Huron have to do with it? I can't remember, but I don't know if any of us came into the town of Port Huron. I don't know. There was no time to party, there was no time to go to the restaurants, there was no time to check out the college. How did we get here? Why? Because we had to find a place to meet. And Sharon Jeffrey, who was one of the SDS members in Ann Arbor. Her mom, Mildred, was a top officer of the United Auto Workers, and she got us the facility on the shore of Lake Huron, the campsite. We'd never been there before. We drove in at dark, I remember that. And we stayed there in this sort of like a compound, using all kinds of devices to stay awake. My favorite one was to sleep in the doorway of the kitchen, so at breakfast people would step on me. Other people use toothbrushes. It seems to be a good way to wake yourself up if you're exhausted. We were exhausted from this. But it did have something to do with Port Huron in retrospect, I think, when we got done. It felt like a spiritual experience, an epiphany. Something had been accomplished. Our lives had changed. We didn't know what was going to happen. And when we finished on the last night, there was an aurora borealis. There was a shower of northern lights over the facility, over the lake. And all of us remembered that like it was a message from God, similar to perhaps the message that God has sent to the Republican convention. I'm a pretty steady guy. I don't believe in these things, but it did happen. It did happen, and it felt, that's what it felt like. So I know what people speak of. And I think that the Northern Lights would only be an example of the role that Port Huron might have played. And you can tell me if I'm off on this, because I'm not trying to flatter anybody in the room. I'm trying to figure out if the location had something to do with it. And I think geography matters. I think the breeze air from the lake that I felt last night when I slept down by the river under the bridge. There's something uplifting that you may not recognize. You may be so used to it, but there's an energy in the air in the Great Lakes region that has the ability to inspire, and I think it helped us get through that week. I'm saying it in all seriousness and get out of there. I've often wondered what happened. So a group of us, explorers, went down to the campsite. It's been long gone. I was there in 1988. I found some sewage pipes. And I thought so much for our work out the sewage into the lake. But I went back today and tried to follow my internal magnetic detector, because the last time when I went looking for it, I found a guy sitting in a truck in the trees. I went up and I said, "Do you know where the Port Huron Statement was written at a camp?" My name. He says, "You're Tom Hayden. It's right over there." And this is like magic. So I knew this would happen today. And so we went down to the approximate location. There's not much that you can see there. And ran into, is it Eddie? Stand up. All right, so Eddie comes up to me. He says, "I knew you'd be here. Been waiting for you." I said, "This is John the Baptist." And he had read in the papers that I was coming. He's on that beach every day. And I know as a good investigator and reporter that if you want the story, you've got to go to the local people who are the primary source. Don't trust the clippings. You've got to go to the spot, and somebody there will know what came before. It's true in California, it's true here. And so he recounted a story that I thought was plausible, and nothing in it for him. He didn't get paid. I think he might be in tomorrow's paper. God knows. He could suddenly be famous, be the end of him. But he said, "Here, right under your feet, take your shoes off, walk in." I didn't want to do that, but he said, "The pipes are right there." and he pointed out the pipes end in these structures out there. And his argument was that that's where the site was, but you know, the tides and the beach, the things change. But I think he's absolutely right, because I knew it when I walked down the path, and I knew that I'd been there before, and it seemed to be in approximately the right place. But you can help me on this if I make a controversial proposal here. How many would like to see a little plaque installed where the Port Huron Statement is? Much, but I may not be around in 50 years. But you know, these signs everywhere that tourists are told to stop at, you can barely read them. They're on copper, and then they say someone killed somebody else on this spot, or something was burned down here, and it's fascinating. I think that there should be such a plaque for Port Huron so that Eddie isn't required to climb. And the reason I say that is that here's what I think about Port Huron, about your community. There is a Lauric landscape, not simply a geographic landscape or a physical landscape. There's a landscape of the heart and mind and the culture where things have happened, and they ought not to be forgotten and washed away in the tidal flow. There should be some markers to help remember these places for anyone that comes later that might have an interest. And I would like to see the whole topography of our country revised to reflect what's been left out. I think it would be very valuable for those who are interested, or those who don't know. And I'm certainly not big on monuments and official ceremonies at all, but I think the history of our lives ought to be written into our landscape. As much as we have battlefields written into our landscape, civil rights monuments in the South written into our landscape. I'm an Irish American. The Irish are just now writing the grave sites where people died from the famine into the landscape of Ireland with little ceremonies and little plaques. I think it's a responsibility, and it's a worthy placing markers in history is helpful. As a memory of those that came before, and as a guidepost or a marker for those who come after. So maybe the next time I'm here, we could just dig a hole and put up a sign so that the directions are clear. The pipes ought to be exposed so people that want to put their foot on them, kind of like the people that think there's holy water. There might be people who think that there's touching the pipes will prevent cancer or recover memory or something, but for whatever reason, it's not a bad thing that there be a small cult of Port Huron with a small marker. Do you agree? That's all I'm saying. Now, what happened? I'm starting to fast forward here, or at least slow forward. The thing I would like to argue is that we had a plan, and the plan could have been achieved. It was a reasonable plan. What we learned was that events are out of our control, that we don't control our lives or our destiny, or even our organizational lives. The plan was, as I've already suggested, to change the power structure in the South, making the Democratic Party a party of civil rights, and awakening a coalition of students and labor and environmentalists that would come to be, and women and middle-class people that would constitute an emerging majority that could actually vote a governor into office or vote a president into office. So the idea was, even though we felt that we were on the margins, we were a tiny handful, our vision was that we could reach all the people in the country, or at least a majority of people. It was not a movement of isolated people looking for comfort to lead their isolated lives. So that was the idea. And certain things happened that indicated that we weren't wrong. One was in 1963, President Kennedy started to turn against the nuclear arms race. He gave a very important speech against it. He initiated with the Soviet Union the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. His Justice Department under his brother Robert turned around and started helping people with the right to vote. They generated private foundation money in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay people in the South to conduct voter registration drives. They anticipated that the white South would become Republican and that for their own political needs, they had to empower blacks and white liberals in the South if they had a chance of holding any of those states. There was the March on Washington of August 1963. That the slogan of it was jobs and justice, indicating the importance we attached to anti-poverty programs and jobs programs. It was not just civil rights and voting rights. It's remembered because of Dr. King's immortal words and speeches, and it's taught that way, that it's like a Sermon on the Mount one time around. What's forgotten is that the UAW that had helped us was putting the money up and the buses and the membership and printing the placards, and that all kinds of people, clergy of all kinds, were descending on Washington, and with the force of numbers were turning around the president, who at first thought it was a dangerous idea because he thought it would antagonize the white South. Then he saw that he couldn't stop it. He agreed with it as well. And he offered conversation and coffee to the demonstration leadership, and you had this incredible demonstration of 200,000 or 300,000 people. So that's the point. First point I want to make is that we thought we were going to become a majority movement that could elect a progressive president and Congress and carry out the proposals of the Port Huron Statement. So what went wrong, or what really happened, has to be considered in that context. It was a heartbreak that no one imagined. First of all, President Kennedy is assassinated. Some people have still not gotten over that. The debate still goes on. But, and I was just down in Texas the other day talking to people who were at the spot when it happened, and they're still disoriented. We were a generation of student activists who did not believe that American presidents were killed. We had forgotten Lincoln, McKinley. We had forgotten the past, which is all the more reason never to forget. But we had forgotten it, and so it was completely traumatizing. We believed, and I think history shows, that Kennedy was planning to get out of South Vietnam as diplomatically as possible. So his death was followed by the Johnson presidency, and now evidence is that Johnson signed papers in '64 saying that he would escalate the offensive against North Vietnam. Then came ground troops. We were supporting, our so-called little radical group was supporting Johnson in '64 on a platform of part of the way with LBJ, because we thought he would keep us out of Vietnam and we could work on poverty, civil rights, education, and so on. Little did we know that presidents lied. Another problem with short memory. Well, these weren't the first presidents that lied, but they were the first that stunned us with their lie. They were lying about a very serious problem, like we were getting drafted for a war we didn't believe in, and they were lying about the war. So as a result of this disaster, I think our movement was derailed or diverted. and it became by the mid-60s more radical, at least in temperament, because now all of us were facing the draft and very, very tough choices. And we didn't have any hope in the Democratic Party because they were the ones that were escalating the war in Vietnam. And so now we felt we were on a collision course with both parties. Goldwater was one, Johnson was the other, and we were being dragged into conscription, and this would mean that the anti-poverty funding would go down the drain, that there would be no money for the domestic objectives that we were fighting for. So that became a major component of how things went wrong, or what happened. I think we also were unaware that we have secret agencies at home as well as abroad in the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency. It was our idea that our student movement would link up with liberal Democrats and unions in this turn away from the spending on nuclear war towards peacetime priorities, domestic priorities. We did not know, but it's known now, we did not learn until '67, that actually the Foreign Affairs Department of the AFL-CIO was an integrated part of the CIA in foreign policy. We did not know that the National Student Association, which we belonged to, was integrated into the CIA as part of foreign policy as well. So this was a further stunning shock, but what it meant was we felt that we had been misled into believing that we could coalesce with labor and our elders to turn away from the war towards the domestic, when in fact too many of our elders were engaged surreptitiously through the CIA in carrying out the foreign policy we were against. The overthrow of the Guatemalan government, the overthrow of the Iranian government, two elected governments, the continuous attempts to kill Castro or turn around the Cuban Revolution. So there was a kind of a counterintelligence program abroad that was secret from the American people and also directed at us. We eventually became listed as people that were possibly dangerous because we were not part of this program of trying to continue the Cold War nuclear arms race and somehow keep tuitions down for students at home and jobs increasing for working people. So that was a very difficult, alienating discovery to realize that the people you're working with actually had secret agendas. They're very nice people, but they happen to be on another payroll without sharing. It's hard to play well with them. And then finally, I would say what we brought on ourselves, I don't isolate us from them. I think we act in a way that's in response to others, but as the crisis deepened in the mid-'60s, there came a new generation of the student movement that thought the Port Huron Statement was not radical enough. It was even condemned as reformist. It's hard to get your mind around this. This means that from a radical perspective, reform was a bad idea. And all we had ever experienced was reform. You could start as far out or left or revolutionary as you wanted, but you were going to get reform if the power structure in large part and half the country were against you. You're going to get to what they call a standoff or compromise. You're not going to get anywhere. But the Voting Rights Act, that wasn't enough. That was pure reform. Voting for the presidential candidate, that was an illusion because they were all dangerous people. That was a reform. And so pretty soon, the Port Huron Statement had to be laid aside as too reformist. And it was succeeded by people who tried to develop a more Marxist philosophy, very erudite people, graduate students, one and all, who wanted to make a class analysis of everything so that students were no longer just students searching for meaning in their lives. Students were part of a proletarian class of knowledge workers who would go into the knowledge industry, and they had to be classified as a class because otherwise you would have to throw out Marxism. Well, that was not a big deal to me because I did not inherit Marxism. I became acquainted with one of the many isms. And so on it went. People kept dividing against each other, taking more and more radical positions. This was partly because the government was actually deserving of some radical response. It was a very urgent time, very existential time. But the idea seemed to be, since we're not getting anywhere with reform, we should escalate our thinking into even more radical ideas and try them, which is not the point of view that I would bring to try to persuade you tonight to join me in some small step. In other words, it caused marginalization, and the FBI was involved in it, the CIA was involved in it, but we were involved in it. It was like an infection that we caught from the extreme situation that we were living in and going through. Other people took the way of LSD as their alternative to the CIA. You know that the LSD was concocted in CIA laboratories. LSD was released on the streets of San Francisco for the first time in the same month that the Vietnam War was escalated by Johnson, but I digress. So you got this counterculture of people who were caught up in drugs, fantasies, revolutionary emotions, which meant that you could really raise hell on a campus. You could bring a campus to a stop. You could hold a strike, but in the same process, you were antagonizing a large section of your parents' generation or the neutrals on campus because they couldn't keep up with this. And so by being more radical, it made us also more marginal. And that also made it more difficult to achieve anything that we had hoped for. If I sound like I'm describing like an inevitable tragedy, I think I am. I'm not blaming anybody here for any part on any side of this. It's more Shakespearean than that as I see it. And the strange thing is that our opponents could be counted on always to go too far. So even if we're going too far, we would win back public support because they went farther. I'm speaking of the Nixon years. He went so far that it wasn't enough to be elected over McGovern. He had to send spies into the Democratic Party headquarters. They got caught by an African-American security guard because they didn't know how to tape a door shut. And they said it was a third-degree burglary or something like that. Suddenly it envelops into a massive constitutional crisis, and Nixon is out of office. We're completely shocked because this didn't fit in with our idea that the system didn't work anymore. This was some people thought this had to be a super plot. What's really behind it? What are they really doing? And all of a sudden, there was this period when the war started to end. Watergate awakened people to the danger of losing your civil liberties. The Democratic Party actually did reform with McGovern, but the split between labor and liberals made McGovern doomed. But you shouldn't look back on McGovern as a failure without looking at the fact that we actually in 4 or 5 years had achieved a democratic process in which women were equal as delegates at the convention. presidential primaries were settled by voters and not in back rooms by bosses, everything was changed. Mayor Daley was no longer a delegate. Jesse Jackson replaced him. This was all too much to fully comprehend. I was on trial for conspiracy to riot. Then we got off, and all of us were acquitted either by the jury or on appeal. And the bottom line, I think that you should go to jail before you run for office, but it turned out the other way around. The people that were in office went to jail as a result of their official misconduct, and this was another very stunning outcome. So what went wrong also had a way of leveling itself out. There we are. The last thing that I'll talk about briefly is now. These books will be sold at discount prices shortly after I terminate. And I was going to go out and say hello and talk to the people who are occupying the lobby. But or you could just, break with the authorities and come on in. You're on the stage. But what was achieved should be tabulated, because you probably have this idea that it was all madness or a blur or inconclusive. But the way history works, achievements are little noted, but they do change things in our personal lives. Here are some of the things that changed in those years. Voting rights for Southern blacks and 18 to 20-year-olds was established. That's a total of 26 million Americans who couldn't vote before those events. The Indochina tragedy ended. There had been 2 million people killed, including 58,000 Americans, in a war that was a tragedy. The compulsory draft that I went through was ended. 2 presidents were driven out of office partly because of public uproar. The Congress woke up and imposed checks on the CIA and the FBI for the first time in the history of the presidency. Amnesty was given to 50,000 draft defeaters across the river here. Relations with Vietnam were normalized. The Freedom of Information Act was passed, and thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, we actually have contending histories of the time. We have our histories, and then we have the classified documents that kind of reveal the official history of what was going on behind the scenes. It's an incredibly rich collection of documents and information. The latest all comes out this month in a book about the Berkeley free speech movement and how it was navigated by the CIA and FBI to the purpose of electing Ronald Reagan governor and president. It's incredible. All based on secret documents, all based on the demand of our people for a more open, transparent government. Those documents were not given over voluntarily. They were the result of litigation. The 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, still contested every minute, every hour, every campaign, but that is absolutely an outcome of the 60s. The environmental laws, the Ralph Nader consumer laws, health and safety laws, the ones that Nixon signed before he was booted out of office were stronger laws than any environmental laws passed since, because he, with the 18-year-old vote, he wanted to bring the youth back. So we got endangered species, we got occupational health and safety, we got the Clean Water, Clean Air Act. All of that came directly after the 60s. The reform of the presidential primary system, I mentioned. Union rights for public employees that didn't exist. They've been left out of the 1930s social contract. First collective bargaining rights for farm workers in 75 years, achieved in California. all kinds of reforms of school and university curriculum so that you know, you can read Noam Chomsky if you want to. Things that were forbidden and only readable on the outside now can bore your mind on the inside of the classroom anytime you wish. I won't talk about the expansion of the liberation of sexual desire. It's quite apparent. I don't think we think of other things as outcome of the 60s. I'll just end with one simple one. Disability rights. You know, when you come to campus and you see the ramps for people in wheelchairs, does it ever cross your mind that in the 60s and 70s, acting on the model of the civil rights movement, that disabled people went to Washington with an agenda of grievances, nonpartisan, and found it necessary to roll themselves in their wheelchairs or march themselves blind into buildings and occupy the buildings until they were promised some kind of redress of their grievances. That's why we have an American with Disabilities Act. And there's not an area of the country, Republican, Democratic, or in between or otherwise, that doesn't take advantage of these funds and slowly, gradually, painfully make reforms that create further access to learning, access to transportation, access simply to shopping and moving around, mobility for millions of people who, largely through no fault of their own, happen to be disabled. So equality rights for that constituency, I think, can only be understood if you trace it back to the 1960s sit-ins and direct action campaigns. Now, as for the moment we're in, briefly, I would say that all you have to do is look at Occupy Wall Street in September of last year, and their first principle, and they didn't agree on anything, but they had one first principle, and lo and behold, it was for a transparent, participatory democracy. They actually echoed the Port Huron Statement. I haven't done my research to find out where those two words came from. It's hard enough to find out who wrote the Port Huron Statement. It might have been Jeff Bridges from Big Lebowski wrote the Occupy Statement. But you'll find there have been student-led democracy movements up and down in waves, and most recently, in kind of impressive ways, trying to do something about Wall Street. The undocumented students, especially where I live in California, have managed to use every method that they could to get the president to make it possible for them to become citizens of this country if they were brought here as children without knowledge that they were coming here, if they've served in the military, if they're in college. That'll be 1.7 new Americans becoming citizens out of the immigrant rights movement that I don't think anybody expected to see. It's actually more than the number of people Obama has deported, and he set a historic record for deportations, but he's now opened the doors to this whole generation, and I think there'll be fascinating leaders of our country for years to come, because their birthright as Americans became cemented through direct action, and they know it. They became citizens. They got the right to become citizens in the same way that the civil rights movement got the right to vote. And so it has an effect. I think you'll see a whole generation of activism composed of people who will do all kinds of splendid things just as a result of that one particular act. I think I won't comment on the election except to simply say that the divisions teach us a lesson about history. The divisions go back to the Civil War. They go back to the Wild West. If you look at the maps of the country, you have a 50-50 division. I have no magic formula for helping people coexist because they have such fundamental differences. Those of us who thought the wars about religion would decline have been wrong. The religious fervor on all sides is extremely high. And it seems to me we do need some kind of conflict resolution process that gets us through this period, because people are becoming more violent and potentially more violent by the day when you have the combination of the president and the recession and all of the politics. This is not what I would have imagined living through when I was 22 years old. It's humbling because it means we who thought we were so smart had no idea what was coming. That what we would set off would have repercussions that were beyond our knowledge. This generation of students certainly has certain opportunities that were built upon the past. More diversity, more equality of access to admissions, more diversity of curriculum, hiring practices. All of that comes out of the Port Huron vision of a university of, by, and for the people, not just for the tiny elites. That's all great. And they've made great contributions in terms of internet online activism, registration and turnout for the young people for Obama campaign. I could make a long list. They've been in the forefront of the environmental movement. Young people don't get recognition for all that they have done just in the past 5 or 10 years. But they have two problems that remind me of Port Huron, and I'll just end by saying what they are. To be blunt, they have no jobs. They see no jobs in the future, and it doesn't matter that much because they're told that the world is ending. You're smiling. And me put it more carefully, but you get the point. We could not imagine that the Great Lakes would rise, that the polar ice caps would melt, that the Midwest would fry and crack open in drought, that we would have extreme weather, and that we would have a scientific consensus saying that if we don't do anything about it, it'll be the end of life as we know it. Everybody should migrate further north or something. When you have at the same time, 25% unemployment in the barrios and ghettos, 10-15% unemployment facing students, the jobs they get have lower wages and benefits. I'm told by somebody that just across the water here, the average Canadian is making $14,000 a year more than the average American here. I'm wondering, is it something about the water we're drinking? What is the exact reason? Are we being subject to some kind of manic experiment in how far people can be deregulated and enjoy it? Or what's the way out of here, as some of us used to ask? I don't have the answer to that, except I have a bizarre form of optimism, and that is I see social change as evolutionary, not just personal action and organization. And there's an instinct to survive and an instinct to adapt, and it often comes at the last moment when you least expect it. So if people are really convinced that the world is just going to hell, do we really expect everybody to individually go to church and pray for it or wait for it? I don't think so. I think people start adapting. They start talking about energy efficiency and green jobs and solar energy and water restoration, and it all seems, oh, that's not enough, that's not enough, that's not enough. But it's something. Obama's budget that everybody laughs about, the stimulus, It includes $200 billion for weatherization, caulking, solar energy, solar collectors, experiments in generating electricity. $200 billion is a lot of money that no future president is going to be able to reverse. It's in the pipeline, it's past the pipeline, it's on the ground, it's going into training programs, it's being used. Is it enough? No. Is it token? Maybe, depending on how big you think the problem is. But I like to always watch what we have gained and see how we can build on it. So I do think that it's the fear and loathing and concern about the environment that is driving our economy towards fuel efficiency, towards energy efficiency, and towards alternatives. And I also think people have this great need to create and make a living, and they will create on their own the pressure necessary to have jobs that are meaningful in the future. We have to get through a period that's terrible. That's all I have to say, but it certainly is no more extreme than the condition that those of us who were young faced if we lived in Alabama or Mississippi in 1960 and looked at the future. Jim Crow forever. I'm 18 years old and I'm going to live under segregation forever. People made a decision they couldn't take that. And they invented solutions like the Voting Rights Act. And they also started to invent solutions to the environment. We forget, at the end of the 60s, 1970, a handful of people created Earth Day. And now I think it's kind of a tedious memory to a lot of people. But 20 million people showed up. 20 million Americans showed up at Earth Day in April 1970. And when they see an opportunity to do something about global warming, they will show up in the many tens of millions. I guarantee it, because I think it's what human beings do when they're faced with really, really dire consequences. And when they do, they will turn to not the holy book of the Port Huron Statement, but they will employ participatory democracy. They will take direct action, and they will argue that the establishment has had its turn and that decisions belong to the people, that everybody has a right to participate, to have a voice in the decisions that affect our lives, and they will prevail. Thanks very much. I'll take more than a couple questions unless I'm stopped. But I wanted to start with this. I publish a bulletin on current issues from the most original take I can get through research. And it goes out to about 20,000 people in 50 cities. And if you would be kind enough or have an interest in it, all you have to do is sign this email sheet, and you'll be on it, and we'll be in touch. And I do hold office hours. I consider it my duty to pacify people that are going off the edge. And my favorite book as a kid was Catcher in the Rye. I remember that. So thank you. Now, any questions? If you just shout them, I can't see you very well, and I'll repeat them.
Yeah, Tom, thank you very much. It was very informative. In 1968, I was a senior in law school at the University of Detroit. Came out of the Catholic neighborhoods in Northwest Detroit. The fascinating thing about you that I haven't heard about is you can share with us, what was the emotional content of that Chicago 7 trial? What about William Kunstler? What about Julius Hoffman?
Invite me back, and we'll speak for an hour and a half on that subject. Briefly, paranoia. We didn't know each other very well. Had big arguments about who would be the lawyer. And the defendants had a hard time getting along, but there's nothing like the state to make you unify. We were accused of the things you hear people accused of all the time, that that we had a diabolical conspiracy to sabotage the convention, and the jury believed half the story and acquitted us on the other half, and then we went to Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and after a long period of time they threw the case out, and the government tried to retry it, gave up, and another judge threw the contempt citations out. So again, it was almost like an awakening from a belief that the system couldn't work to being exonerated by the judges, and the people who were going after us wound up indicted on criminal corruption charges at the same time. So it was kind of a transformative, I won't say a spiritual awakening, but a shock, and it just taught me that kind of a really deep lesson. You never know. It's like one step at a time. Very short, succinct philosophical statements. You never know. Don't listen to the people who say this is what's going to happen if we do this, because they don't really know.
Young woman over there, actually, in the middle. Yes, yes.
I have a question. You're talking about participatory democracy, and you mentioned Occupy Wall Street. What about the Tea Party?
The Tea Party is definitely participatory democracy. I would classify them as a counter movement against what was achieved in the 60s, against Obama, and they go back as they've never been a majority movement that took over, but they've been a counter movement, like Goldwater movement in '64 was against everything, and Johnson fooled them. Fooled all of us, said it wasn't going to. He said, "I'll never send an American boy to Vietnam." Remember? Unbelievable. So that's where I think the Tea Party fits in. I will demonstrate here. You can hear me? These two lines give you the Tom Hayden summary of how it works. The top line is the way the Machiavellians, that is the power people, operate. And the bottom line is how movements arise. In the beginning on the left, the Machiavellians have hegemony, means complete control of what people think and so on. And the movement people who are protesting are totally marginal. If the movements touch a chord of memory, they will get some support going, especially if the system overreacts. Now, the movement will get to 5, 10, 15, 20%. At some point, they march into the mainstream where they have 25 to 40% support. They could actually win elections in Ann Arbor. I don't know about Port Huron, Berkeley, LA. And they can field candidates in primaries. And at this point, politics kicks in because politicians want to be for them or against them, depending on what district the politician represents. At a certain point, the moderates in the movement combine with the moderates in the establishment to create a reform that has two purposes. One is a victory for the movement based on what they originally wanted, and two is the establishment gets to restore stability or order, having given up something. I don't mean a small thing, like if you let half the country vote, the women, that's a big reform. But it didn't lead to a further revolution. It empowered and equalized women at the ballot box. Then, as I said, when the reform succeeds, the movement demobilizes. And the counter movement, like the Tea Party, is stronger. And that's the cycle. That's how it goes. It doesn't end. And the final battlefield, the one we're on tonight, is the battlefield over memory. Movements like to preserve the legacy. We want to have a little plaque at Port Huron. The tyrants want to eliminate the legacy, wash it away like sewage on the beach, forget about it, never happened, thinking that if nobody knows that it ever happened, it won't happen again. And then in the middle are the politicians of memory. These are the people I have the hardest time with, that like to selectively choose a famous movement person for a postage stamp so that we remember them, but Malcolm X gets to be a postage stamp. That's about it. Or a building will be named after them. So that's kind of the pattern. And I'll show you the other slides as we go. Yes.
Is this a throwaway election?
Is this a throwaway election? I don't know what you mean.
I'm saying that are the Republicans trying to lose because
Oh.
if Obama gets back in, then we'll have like a world economic crisis.
That's very conspiratorial. I hadn't thought of that. I just can't imagine Karl Rove hoping to lose. He's a tough guy. He was the head of Young Americans for Freedom College Republicans against SDS back in 62, 63. No, I don't think it's a throwaway election. I think that the addition of Paul Ryan gives that wing of the Republican Party hope that they can repeat the Wisconsin miracle where they beat back the public unions and reelected Scott Walker. And you can see with Ryan on the ticket, the vote has become closer in Wisconsin. So I think they're pursuing a Wisconsin strategy. I don't know what the outcome will be. So no, everybody's fighting to win. They're fighting to win. Both sides, all sides. I can't see somebody up there pick somebody in the shadowy.
What about the Supreme Court decision on donors?
Supreme Court decision, well, that's a new one. I don't think we imagined that the money problem would get so bad, and I'm very glad you brought it up. This comes from speaking without notes. I think people have every right to protest the influence of money, the Supreme Court decision, and to go to the ballot box early and argue with the registration teams to keep the voting place open, give people long enough time to be able to participate, make sure students are not pushed out of the ability to vote, make sure that the lines in extremely cold states are not 4 hours long, and bring monitors, bring complaints. If it's a contested election, we've seen the danger of stolen elections, and people should just say, we don't want this stolen, and it might make people back away who have that intention of trying to distort it. Then, I don't know, we march on the Supreme Court, I suppose. Something has to happen. It's another generation of lawyers has to be trained in the following fundamentals. One, the founders did not mean that money was an instrument of free speech. There's no record. And two, corporations are not people under the equal access provisions of the 14th Amendment. Corporations are legal, they're constitutional, they're chartered by charters. There's no evidence that they're part of the 14th Amendment equation. So that's a short way of saying I don't expect this to ever end without a public argument, public outcry, and a court that finds that it's unconstitutional, just as segregation was finally defeated in the court in an argument after 8,000 legal briefs were filed again and again and again. Yes, you can run for office against big money. Yes, you can picket, march, go online, petitions against big money. But until the court majority is persuaded by a new generation of Thurgood Marshall types. Thurgood Marshall was the young lawyer who spent his whole life trying to get Brown versus Board of Education. Whole life. Finally got there. I don't think it'll happen because that's the particular nature of our system. The checks and balances make things so gradual, it will take a very long time. But, you start with specific issues, like maybe people think it's all right for money to be equated with speech. but how do they feel about the money being secret till after the election? I think that's a very vulnerable argument, and that's the Republican argument, the Supreme Court argument, that tens of millions can be spent on the election, and we don't get to find out where the money came from until the election is over. If they're going to argue that, they should at least say, well, you have a recourse, we can have a recount or redo the election all over again if these 5 things have been found. Like the election was bought by filthy pornographers with foreign money. They don't do anything, they just simply say, ha, money's freely expended, and you can't know where it came from. This takes us way back into time. Disclosure, think about it, is very important. When you learn, she took money from who, he took money from who, it does register. It might be a small thing, but you forget what it was like before we had disclosure laws. Now we have disclosure laws, and they're trying to remove those in the same decision. This year, we will find out after November where the money came from. Yes?
I'd like to know what your thoughts were on the country and the government after the incident in Kent State back in 1968.
Kent State was 72. I'm going to Kent State on for an anniversary on October 28th. From there to Ann Arbor for the final conference on the Port Huron Statement, for everybody that can hobble there. We'll all be there. What I learned about Kent State that's new for the record is that our prosecutors in Chicago thought by suppressing us at the Chicago trial that they would end the anti-war movement because they had this model that it was led by conspirators like ourselves. Actually, the protests increased not because there were conspirators, but because Nixon invaded Cambodia. And when he invaded Cambodia and announced it, a small rally turned into a gigantic uprising, and all over the country. And a large number of young people were killed at Kent State or wounded. One of them was giving the finger to a National Guardsman. I know him. That's not cause for shooting somebody. And he lives with that remorse. All the rest were shot in the back or at a great distance while they were standing and watching or crossing campus on their way to class. Who perpetrated it was never uncovered. Grand jury never functioned properly. There were settlements paid to the families. Every year at Kent State on May 4th, there's a solemn march around the area. I've been on one of those. The university president participates, and they mark the place where, with chalk, where the bodies fell. And they go through the grieving, the memory, and also the education of the student body. The same thing happened the next week, or about the same time at Jackson State, where 2 undergraduate students, African Americans, were shot in their dorms or in front of their dorms after the police had tried to break up some kind of march. I've been there also, and it's very surreal, you know. I feel like I'm a ghost because all the students on these campuses are walking by, and it's really 2012, and this happened before they were even imagined. And there are marks on the wall, there are bullet holes on the wall, there are bullet holes through signs, and they walk past. And if it wasn't for those of us who want to keep memory alive, the memory would be lost forever. And we haven't even begun to uncover all that happened, but I think about it all the time. But our prosecutors thought it would put an end our going to jail would put an end to all this. Instead, our prosecutor told me he blamed the Ohio National Guard and Nixon for starting it up. He had a strange idea that the anti-war movement had been pacified because of the Chicago trial. Then these trigger-happy people shot the students at Kent State, then it started again. Not really how it happened, but that was his version. A couple more questions.
What's your take on the Cheney affair with Iraq, the lies?
What's my take on the Cheney affair? I thought he had some. The guys had several pacemakers. I didn't know he had an affair with anyone. I spent 10 years of my life trying to end the war in Iraq. I've had enough. I think all of you have had enough. We know that Cheney made it. Cheney made a catastrophic mistake. He doesn't recognize it. He doesn't admit to it. He sought with great skill to avoid being indicted in the Scooter Libby affair. And I wish him well. I'm a heart patient too. So I share Obama's feeling that Obama shouldn't go back into it. But from the point of view of the storytellers and the keeping of memory, there's all the more reason for us to keep discussing these things, reading about them, because it sure is as hell as possible that it can happen again. This Romney ticket could use better advice on foreign policy. No, it seems to be, I'm not pro or con here, I'm just saying, it seems like he's recruited as foreign policy advisors. Everyone's qualification is they got us into the Iraq war. He hasn't added anybody that recognized that, oh, that was a big mistake, and I'm here to prevent Romney from repeating the mistake. They're all people that deny it was a mistake, think it was a good idea, think the media was their big enemy, and so they're likely to lead him into similar mistakes. That's the part that I worry about. Yes?
I'd like to hear your comments about...
You're the last one up there, man. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to hear your comments about somebody who's dear to your past and always in my mind, your former wife.
Dear to my past? Well, yeah, that's true. That's my comment. I'm like an archaeological dig. You know, I had a long marriage to Jane Fonda. It was back when I was middle-aged. Not long ago. I've been married to a woman named Barbara Williams for 19 years. We have a 12-year-old. Jane and I have a son, Troy, and a stepdaughter, Vanessa, and other kids, and we see each other on vacations or are in contact or in touch. She's still acting, and maybe I can leave it there, but I don't know what to say. It's been a long time. It was a great marriage, long marriage, ended, and the archaeological dig continues.
Tell us about your book, The Long 60s, because I think...
Is that Shirley?
Yeah, it's Shirley.
Oh, the plant.
Yeah.
That's my high school girlfriend. She lives on a farm here in Michigan, wherever we are. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad to see you.
Did you bring all your girlfriends?
But the book's The Long 60s, I think...
That's too long a talk, but here's the short
Well,
of it.
just mention that you have a book that is the background, all that you've said tonight.
She's a good organizer. She's trying to drive the point home at your expense, but God bless her. All right, so here's the deal. Where's the clicker? Right here. All right, so this is the short form. The movements are over here. This wall is the system, the social system. Over here are the Machiavellians, the people that for 500 years Their job is to preserve the order. Okay? Reform takes place when the movement cracks open the system and becomes incorporated into the system. A reform is defined as an institutional opening has been created. People are empowered who previously were not. And there are tangible benefits like Social Security or a wage increase. That's a reform. That's not a meaningless reform. Where's the next? Oh, thanks. So the reform gets established right here in the middle of the social order, right here in the middle of Port Huron. The response of the counter movement is to try to contain the memory of it, co-opt it by saying Tom Hayden is living proof that we live in the greatest democracy on earth, because otherwise he would be in a Russian prison. And there's a backlash, which is stop it, kill it, defund it, whatever has to be done. But they try to avoid getting rid of the reform altogether because they fear that that'll set things up again. So they would like defund reproductive rights, but the extreme ones would eliminate it, which would then set the stage for another people. Next. That's it. This is the last one. This is the merry-go-round of life. There's a lot of Christians believe that there's a struggle between good and evil that ends in the plateau of heaven. And Marxists believe the same thing as Christians, that the struggle between two classes will end in communism and then eternal plateau of shared wealth and so on. But what if it's like this? It never ends. Are you ready for that? In other words, the movements are coming from below, and as they gain force, they are stopped by the Machiavellians. Two cycles, continually. And this space here, to me, is the greatest thing about America. And the thing we have to be most embracing of, I call it reform. Reform is not a thing. Reform is an atmosphere among us that, among other small things, allows this meeting to occur. There are people that don't want this meeting to occur. It allows people to say what they have to say. There are some who don't want it said. So reform is dynamic. It's not static. It's not a given. You don't win your rights and keep them and move on. Your rights are always as precarious as you are weak, and your rights are only as strong as you yourself are forceful. And if you think of it that way, most of the things that we like about our country are included in that reform space. They didn't come entirely from the movements. They certainly didn't come from the establishment. They come as a result of a clash that leads to certain outcomes that we call reforms. Is that what you wanted me to say, Cheryl?
In your book, The Long 60s.
Yeah, and I'll sell it to you for $10. It's 70% off. But we have to go out in the hallway. Thank you so much for coming.